Didn't see you there. Good afternoon, Sci-Fi Fantasy. Hope your Friday's going swell. Mine is. Today during my Tech Talk, I'm going to be taking you through a journey through the deeper meaning behind demonic figures in dark fantasy. So I'm pretty confident 90% of you have probably seen or read a horror film or book. Some of you may like it, some of you may not. It's not for everyone. But I want your undivided attention either way. I will be covering 4 fairly popular stories involving a demonic figure, so to speak. The first one I will be looking at is called It. I'm sure many of you have seen it, but I'm going to give you guys some background either way. So the story begins in a small town of Maine with a group of kids. The Losers Club is what they're known for. And all these kids are being hunted by this evil creature, this clown, called It. Of course, they're going throughout their days and they just can't figure this thing out, and their parents know better and choose to ignore the phenomenon. But as the children learn more about the town, they realize it's not the town that they thought it was. It has much darker background than they were brought up in. A few examples of this is Mike, who is one of the African American characters in this story. He is tormented by these racist bullies constantly, every day. There's another character, Beverly. She is consistently being sexually assaulted by her father. All of these disparate evils would of course exist without the creature, because it happens in all towns, unfortunately. But it intensifies all of these through his rage, his violence, his hatred, his lawlessness, racism, misogyny, and sexual predation, all while disguised as a clown. To me, there's much more meaning behind that. Once the children became disgusted with the clown, rather than fearful of the clown, he no longer had control of them. His control was their fears. And as soon as their fear turned into disgust, he lost his control. I found a quote that I think represents this idea and really brings the story a good message, a good moral to it. The acceptance of evil is a trap, and we must set ourselves free. To me, the clown is them accepting this evil around them, but they must not be scared. They must be disgusted by it to break free, in order to become free from this fear that is driving every one of their actions. The next piece of work I will be diving into is The Raft by Stephen King. The Raft is a short story in the book Skeleton Crew. Brief summary of the story: it begins with 4 teens, 2 boys, 2 girls, decide to go have some fun on a remote lake. They get to the lake, they drink a little bit, smoke a little bit, decide to go. It's a good idea to go swim out into the middle of the lake there's a raft, a floating raft. Randy, one of the main characters, one of the boys, he sees this, what he describes as an oil slick in the water. At first doesn't really think anything of it. Maybe it's an accident, maybe he's just seeing it. He just genuinely didn't think it was on purpose. He was seeing it for real. And this is a huge impact on the story and the meaning behind it. So I'm going to relate the oil slick to hyperobjects. Hyperobjects are objects that have vitality. And if you don't know what that means, basically, vitality means they have strength, power, but they cannot be touched. So a simple example would be climate change. It has huge significance over our world, but it's not something that we can physically touch. So jumping back to the story, when Randy originally ignored the oil slick, thinking it was not on purpose. This relates back to our life and hyper objects in our life. So we consistently move freely among these seemingly lifeless objects that are far away. They can be close, but they always find their way onto, into, or through us. Just like the oil slick, he would wrap himself around his victims. He would go through them. He would devour them. And I think one of by having the oil mass or oil slick as the only deadly monster in this story is it reminds us of the power of objects in our world that can change and even destroy us if we let them. Yeah. For my third piece of work, I'll be looking at Stephen King's Pet Sematary. So just to give you guys a little summary on Pet Sematary, if you haven't seen it or read the book, it's about a doctor and his family who moved to this small town, and his daughter's cat dies, and then it's called Pet Sematary. They have a pet cemetery behind their house, but their neighbor takes him and the cat, the father and the cat, without anyone else knowing, to the real cemetery, which is like this really old Indian ritual burial ground, and the guy's like, why would you bring me here? He's like, just trust me. So they bury the cat, and they go back. Nothing really happens. The next day, the cat is alive, and it looks the same, but it definitely just acts different. It's not the same. And eventually, they realize okay, this cat is the cat starts murdering things. Super weird. And so later on, his their younger son gets hit by a car, and of course the dad's thinking, why don't I just bring him there? Obviously, it's everyone's gonna know. One night so they already buried his son, and one night he sneaks out, and he takes his son out, and he brings him to the cemetery where they buried the cat, and he buries him. And his son comes back, and he's like a demon, basically. And the father obviously he sees what happened, and the whole family sees, and everything's basically just done with that. Yeah, I'm not gonna ruin the rest of the story for you guys. Anyway, so I'm gonna talk about the moral and kind of just a message of that story. Obviously, we can look at it as there's a lot of things that we want so bad that we ignore the consequences of. Not just like the father did. He wanted his son back so bad that he didn't care what the consequences were. He knew his son was going to be different. That's something that we do all the time. We want something so bad, we just ignore the consequences. I struggle with it. You probably struggle with it. Everyone does. There's a little bit more to it, though. So if you ask yourself the question, would you do it? And if you had a dog that you loved or something, a cat maybe, would you do it? You knew that it would be a little bit different, but would you do it? I think to myself, probably not. It's a pretty easy no. I don't want a demon cat or something. But you can look at it as more as how often do we refuse to let our past stay buried? Our past is something that can really deter us from a greater future if we let it. If we refuse to let it stay buried, it will always haunt us consistently. I think that's what Stephen King was trying to portray in this whole story of horror and terror, but I think there's a greater meaning that it can relate to our life and something that we can all learn.